I think there's still people filing in, but I think we're going to get started. Good morning and welcome. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar this morning, convened with the Middle East Institute, looking at annexation and what it means, Israeli perspectives. This webinar is part 3 of a 3-part series co-organized between the Foundation for Middle East Peace and the Middle East Institute and co-moderated by myself and Khalid Al-Gindi, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute. Some quick context. Under the governing agreement, the new Israeli government, which was just sworn in, formal annexation can be advanced as early as July 1st, and that government was sworn in yesterday, with Netanyahu appearing to double down on his intention to annex. For its part, the US is deeply involved in planning and mapping annexation, and Secretary of State Pompeo was actually in Israel just last week. In all of this as context, there's a lot of chatter about whether this will happen, when it'll happen, how it would happen, and what can be done to stop it. And that's not what we're looking at in this series. In this series, we are delving into the issue of what annexation would mean in practice for various stakeholders and perspectives, and really how we got here. So part 1 examined annexation from the perspective of US, European, and Arab states. And part 2 examined Palestinian perspectives on annexation. If you missed those, you can watch those on the Foundation website or on the MEI website. And today we are going to examine Israeli perspectives. Over to you, Khalid.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks to all of you for joining us in our third and last part of our series. To help us better understand this issue, we've lined up a really excellent panel of experts. I'll introduce them, but you can find their bios, full bios for all of our panelists for this and previous sessions on the FMEP and MEI pages dedicated to this event. First, we have Shaked Morag, who is Executive Director of Peace Now. And we also are very happy to be joined by Yehuda Shaul, a co-founder of Breaking the Silence. And I should add that our third panelist, Galia Golan, had an emergency and unfortunately was forced to cancel at the last minute. So unfortunately, we will not have her. But we should still have, I think, a very informative and insightful discussion. The format for this morning or for today's webinar is it will be moderated by Laura and I. We'll pose questions to the panelists. You, the audience, are welcome to submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can do that at any time throughout our conversation, and we'll try to incorporate as many of those audience questions as we can into the conversation. And if there's time at the end, we'll try to get to those outstanding questions. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online immediately after it ends. Lastly, let me say that if you have any technical problems, you can let us know using the chat function. Also located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please don't use the chat function to pose questions. Please do that in the Q&A function. With that, let's go ahead and get started.
Yes, I'm unmuted. Everyone remember to unmute yourself when you speak. Something we've all had to learn. So I want to use this first round of questions to ask our panelists to help us understand how events in Israel have gotten us to where we are today, where there is this great political and to some degree popular consensus around annexation. So Shaked, I want to start with you. The organization you lead, Peace Now, in Israel, in Hebrew, Shalom Akshav, has been at the forefront historically of civil society efforts to fight de facto annexation since it's been happening really since the 70s and 80s. Can you talk to us a little bit about what de facto annexation has looked like up until this point, specifically through the lens of settlement construction, expansion of settlement infrastructure, and all of that?
So along the many years of occupation in the West Bank, we've witnessed the settlement enterprise as the main tool for land acquisition and for territorial facts on the ground to be set. We're talking about by now, according to our count from last year, more than 400,000 settlers that are living in the West Bank, meaning outside of the Green Line, not including the Jerusalem already annexed territories east of the Green Line. And its very obvious goal is to establish those facts on the ground and to dissect, to cut the land to pieces in order for the territory to not serve any future Palestinian state. And when we talk about de facto annexation, the more Israelis that live on an occupied territory, first we talk about policy that is in the eyes of the world and also in the eyes of the Israeli legal system is something temporary that is happening. Whenever it was brought to Supreme Court in Israel, it was justified as part of security strategy and responding to security needs, and as a temporary situation that happens only as long as these territories are occupied, because occupation is considered a temporary state of the land, because otherwise we wouldn't have to formally annex it. But at the same time, we see that roads are being paved by the government, that infrastructure is being built, and that both formal and informal ways are used in order to acquire more and more land. And I'll give just two examples for the formal and non-formal ways of acquiring the land. A formal example is a research done by our Settlement Watch department here in Peace Now. We've counted all the land that was allocated by Israel planning bodies to use of for civil causes in sea territories where Israel manages the lands. So we found out that nearly 100% of it was allocated to Jewish settlers. If to be exact, 99.8% of the allocated land was targeted at Jewish settlers' needs, while communities that live just beside them with similar needs for civil expansion and for public infrastructure that needs land don't get allocation of land by Israel, meaning that the resource of land that is managed by the Israeli occupation is seen as an asset aimed only to the Israeli and Jewish needs. So this is the formal policy. I mean, it's not transparent. We had to reveal it, but it's something that Israel formal system has been doing for a long while by now. And the non-formal way, which is legalized retroactively, is the illegal outpost system. During the last 2 decades, with even 3 decades by now, they will build around 150 illegal outposts in the West Bank, meaning settlers independently take over land, build houses, and force the state to acknowledge it and to give it resources and infrastructure, and then demand its regularization retroactively. And Israel once turns a blind eye to this expansion of settlement, which is not formal and that never comes to a public debate in Israel and never gets a real discussion and a democratic process of voting for this expansion and de facto annexation. And second, after effects have been set on the ground, the authorities say, okay, these are Israeli citizens, they need to get fair treatment as citizens, so we need to supply infrastructure and services and even budgets to support them. And there the illegal becomes mainstream and part of the Israeli system. So I maybe will elaborate on that later, but what we are in a way a bit content to see now is that for the first time, the Israeli policy of the government is uncovering itself. The masks are off, and the de facto annexation that was covered underneath independent cases, and peace now had to reveal the chain of single foundings and show that this is aimed at de facto annexation. This is the first time that the prime minister comes and says, yes, we want to, that's what we actually want to do. We want to annex. Now it can be brought to public debate and for maybe a democratic decision.
Thank you. So Yuda, following up on what Shaka just laid out, so people talking about annexation today, certainly the debate in the media, treats this as if the idea of Israel de jure officially publicly saying we're going to keep all the land, that this is somehow a new plan, a new idea under Bibi, under Trump. I want you to explore that idea. What's wrong, what's right about that. This is something where I think the history is important. I think it's little understood.
So good morning, and first of all, thank you for having us, and thanks for everyone who's joined us this morning. I would take what Shaked started with and say, double down on this. I think it's more than just unmasking. And Lara, you're right. The idea of annexation has been there from day one. Depends for who and by who. So if we look at the history, I would say in the past 53 years, there was more or less 4 different ideas out there of what should Israel do with the people and the territory between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And the first school of thought was what I would call the annexation camp. Exactly this. Formal sovereignty, river to the sea, needs to be ours. What do we do with the people? Of course, we're not talking about giving equal rights to Palestinians, right? So at best, apartheid. At worst, transfer, yeah? At the edges of the radical right, the idea of transferring Palestinians has been there. And anyone who follows this issue can find it. Now, this is here from day one of the occupation. Already in '67, the so-called Movement for Greater Israel was formed. By the way, back then, this idea was more mainstream politically within political party structures than today. Yeah, part of the leadership of the Movement for Greater Israel were from within the Labor Party circles. Okay, then we have Gush Emunim, the settler movement in '74, and we see it today. So we kind of like have this history. The second school of thought or political camp, how you want to call it, is what I would call the control camp. The idea that between the river and the sea, we need to make sure that there is only one sovereign power. This is because of a national security strategy concept. We are in a zero-sum game. It's either us or the Palestinians. That's why it better be us. That's why Palestinians can never be free. And that we see from day one also. The Alon Plan, anyone who remembers, the idea of dividing the West Bank to 2 strips, north to south, and taking the Jordan Valley to Israel in order to turn the Jordan River into the eastern border of Israel, and other plans up to today. But this camp never wanted to basically annex the population or all the territory. It was about being in control. So we can do a state minus, a municipality minus, yeah? If you're Bibi Netanyahu, that's where I would put him. But a true sovereign Palestinian state beside Israel is seen as a national security threat. The third camp, or the third school of thought, is where I am, and I think all of us here on the call, is what I would call the equality camp. What drives us is a value-based principle. Everyone, river to the sea, needs to be equal under the law they live. Now, most of the camp believes that the political program that will deliver equality is two states. That's where I am. Some believe in a one secular democracy, river to the sea. I think that's an illusion, but we can touch that in a different day. There is another fourth school of thought, which is maybe the most outspoken person or well-known person of that camp today is Lieberman. It's an old school, 19th century, beginning 20th century concept of a nation state, a pure ethnic state. So we will divide the territory river to the sea according to ethnic lines. That's why for that group in Israeli politics, for Lieberman, a Palestinian inside the Green Line is more of a threat than a Palestinian outside the Green Line. That's why he always talks about population swaps. Yeah, that's why all his slogans are about Palestinian citizens of Israel, no loyalty, no citizenship. Yeah, he targets them more than Palestinians in the occupied territories. It's about purifying ethnically the state of Israel from its non-Jewish citizens. And in a way, I would say that the Trump plan has actually put that idea of maximizing ethnic purity together with the annexation and called it peace by formalizing apartheid. Yeah, because with the Trump plan, Palestinians in the areas we annexed don't become Israeli citizens. About 100 to 120,000 Palestinians from East Jerusalem who are today residents basically lose that status for the so-called Palestinian capital Al-Quds and putting on the table the idea of stripping Palestinian citizens of Israel in the so-called triangle from their citizenship and moving them to Palestine. So annexing, formalizing apartheid with purifying ethnically as much as we can the parts that Israeli control. So just to sum it up, I would say that throughout the last 53 years, out of these four schools of thoughts, there was one idea that was dominating Israeli politics up to the last 5 years, and that was the control camp. Being it Peres, Rabin, Golda, Begin, yeah, it was not about formalizing annexation. It was about we need to control for our security, yeah. How do we rearrange it? Palestinians are challenging it. What is our answer? Yeah, we'll find different forms of how to label it, how to formalize it, yeah. But it wasn't sovereignty river to the sea without Palestinian rights or expelling them. What's happening now in Israeli politics, I think it is a breaking change. I think it's more than unmasking. I think what we see is that the annexation camp that has always been there on the hilltops of the West Bank, yeah, and the outpost, the settlement enterprise that Shaked spoke very well about, that is kind of like the implementation, the facts on the ground that the annexation camp has been working with the help of the government, but driving. They are now have emerged from the hilltops of the West Bank to the cabinet table. And for the first time in the history of Israel, we have more than half of our cabinet up front publicly in favor of formalizing control over Palestinian sovereignty without giving rights, i.e. formalizing apartheid. There's no other way of saying this.
Thank you, Yehuda. If I could stay with you for a minute, I actually want to get both of you to elaborate a little bit more on what annexation looks like from a practical standpoint. Yehuda, what does actual implementation of annexation look like on the ground? You know, beyond simply saying we've now annexed the land. You know, what happens to the military regime? Things like the civil administration. What does the day after look like on the ground for Palestinians or for settlers or for the army in the West Bank?
So I don't think we can answer fully this question because we don't know exactly what kind of annexation and if it will take place. Yeah, I think we are in a moment where, mainly driven by the Trump administration plus Netanyahu's legal problems, we're seeing a chance that the annexation camp will prevail and we might see it. But if that goes, and we don't know exactly what part of the West Bank it will include. Is it only the so-called blocks around Jerusalem or the seam zone, the kind of like route of the separation barrier? Is it the Jordan Valley? Even though, because the Trump plan is a driving force behind this, probably we could assume that the Trump plan is more or less the map that we're going to end up with, plus minus. Yeah, that's a conceptual map, as was said to us. And even the Trump plan, by the way, could be implemented gradually. Yeah, it might be that the Israeli-American mapping committee that is now actually drawing the lines will not complete its work by July. So the meaning of annexation, after saying that, the meaning of annexation is that the territory that is annexed, Israeli law applies there. So the annexation happens in one moment. There is a declaration by the government, or there is a legislation by the Knesset, or both. And then Israeli law, Israeli civil law applies there. Israeli Knesset parliament becomes the sovereign power, replacing the military commander. Okay? Implementation of that decision will take time. Yeah? Because you need to standardize the laws. They're not the same. Planning, etc., regulations of everything. You need to build Israeli civilian institutions there, courts, other departments of, of the ministries, etc. So implementation will take time. Still, I would say the impact can be very dramatic on different fronts. I will mainly talk about three very quick. One is on land ownership. Okay. The second Israeli law applies on an annexed territory. Israeli laws include few things. One of them is what is called the absentee property law, which is a law that was passed in the beginning of the 50s that says that every resident of the land of Israel that is either in an enemy state, and there is a list of some Arab countries, or in the land of Israel that is not the state of Israel, i.e. West Bank, Gaza back then, or today it will be an annexed territory. Yeah. His lands are nationalized. Yeah. That's how we took the lands of refugees, of Palestinian refugees throughout the 50s. Okay. So any annexed territory, let's say we annexed the 30% of the West Bank under the Trump plan, or we annexed Area C, the 60% of the West Bank, Palestinians who own land but live in the unannexed territories, or outside, yeah, the refugees, or they go to travel, we can take their land right away. And that can be a significant amount of land, because after all, Area A and B are the built-up areas. That's where the PA has some authority. Yeah, Area C, the full Israeli control, is mainly the open spaces. Another thing that can happen is basically, I think in the US it will be called eminent domain, expropriation for public use. Today under occupation, that is very limited for Israel to use it, because under international law and Israeli Supreme Court decisions, the public that it needs to serve needs to include Palestinians. So we take it here and there for roads, but we can't take it for settlements. But once we annex, we can expropriate as much and whatever, and even registered, recognized private Palestinian land can be taken like this. And we're talking about half of the lands of Area C that can be taken right away in this way. If in the West Bank until today, in 53 years of occupation, Israel took from Palestinians about 18% through different mechanisms, which we don't have the time to go into, declaring state land, seizing for security purposes, and expropriation. And East Jerusalem, more than 1/3 was expropriated. And inside the Green Line, the data talks about more than 40%. So Israel has a history of expropriation for public use, way more land from Palestinians than any other tool that we've used in the West Bank. And the last thing maybe I'll say, just not to drag it too long, is the issue of displacement of Palestinian communities. Already today, Palestinian communities in Area C, many of them are under enormous pressure, yeah, in order to forcibly displace them and basically clear the area, push them into A and B. the fact that Israel controls the population registry, by the way, also in Gaza until today, yeah, people don't tend to know, not only in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. That means that many of these residents of Area C on paper, even if their villages are recognized, in many cases they are registered as inhabitants of a nearby village. So Israel can come and say, guys, you're now illegal aliens in your home. You need to go out of Israel. Yeah. And suddenly there is another way and form of pressure that Israel can put to displaced Palestinians. And the last one, if I may, very short, Palestinian land that is annexed might be put under the authority of settler regional councils and municipalities that will give the settlers the authority to carry demolitions of so-called illegal structures. So today, Palestinians have, water cisterns and farming land in Area C, etc., and other agricultural structures that have a demolition order because Israel doesn't give building permits for Palestinians in Area C, while the Israeli army is today responsible to carrying out the demolition and demolishes 500, 600 to 1,000 a year. Still, there is 18,000 demolition orders. Once you will give this authority to the settler regional councils, I'm willing to put everything I have that they're going to run into deficit in order to make sure and suddenly enforce the law and enact 110% of these demolition orders, which will also harm significantly Palestinians on the ground. And there's many more, but these are just few examples. So this is not more business as usual. This is a significant change.
Thanks, Yehuda. I mean, you've outlined a very, very bleak and dramatic picture for what the day after looks like. Shaked, I'm wondering if you agree with the picture that Yehuda has painted for us, and if you could give us your own impressions on what the day after looks like. Yehuda mentioned that we don't know exactly where or what will be annexed, but we have a pretty good idea. And I know that the folks at Peace Now have a deep familiarity with the realities on the ground. And so even if we don't know the map, I feel like, as someone who also once worked on Israeli settlements, I feel like we could probably come up with a reasonable approximation of where we think those lines might actually be. Could you draw your own picture of what the Trump plan and annexation might look like?
So thank you. Look, first I want to say something about the logic behind the Trump plan and the map that it draws. It does follow in a way the ethnic lines, and it does something that you Americans are very familiar with, sort of gerrymandering. It says, let Israel have as much land as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. Let the vast majority of Israeli settlers, nearly all of them, stay in their homes and not be evacuated, while Palestinians, as you just said, might be removed in different ways or rationalization or legal ground. But what is important to know is that the final line will be something that doesn't resemble any border of any state that we know. It will be a segmented border with many enclaves and roads and tunnels that dissect it. And as you just said, in order to have it built on the ground, you have to invest many years. It's not only building courts and civil service, but also to actually dig and pave and build walls and change the actual ground. So there might be a case that the day after annexation looks just like the day before annexation, and the only thing that has changed is the idea of what is the legal basis of the life in the West Bank. So Israeli settlers will now know that they are seen as the Israeli citizens inside the Green Line, and Palestinians will still be left with no rights. So many people in Israel say, okay, so life is not going to change for Israelis in the day after. Yuda just made a general outline of risks that Palestinians are going to be facing, but many Israelis ask us what is the change that we are going to sense in our lives. And it's important to say that some of that change is subject to a chain reaction by Palestinians, by the region, and by the international community. So when someone, an Israeli, asks me, okay, what does annexation has to do with my life? I say, okay, you are currently enjoying the communication between Israel authorities and the Palestinian authorities that are working together to prevent terror. The day after a unilateral step is made, no matter, by the way, the size and shape of it, once it's made, this coordination might be cut, and the result will be a bigger threat to Israel's security than before. We've already heard, and it's not a surprise to us, that the Jordanian king is not going to welcome this unilateral step. Again, it doesn't matter where exactly it's going to be and how big. It contradicts our agreement with Jordan. It also contradicts our understandings and long-standing relations with Egypt. And it also is already met with criticism in the international community, including the countries in the European Union, and also with some criticism from the US. So this one way to look at it is the pro-annexationist view that this now, because Trump is on the wheel, there is a narrow window of opportunity to annex without being punished and sanctioned by the US. But on the other hand, there is a wider community internationally that might sanction Israel, and this is regardless of the actual step that is taken. And if I have to talk a bit more about the actual step, big or small, then Trump plan does draw the map, and I think that we think that Netanyahu might implement it in one of two ways. One way is the play chicken. Say, this is the narrow window of opportunities. I'm going to do it. And let's see what the international community does. Let's see if Jordan is bold enough to cut relations with Israel, if the EU manages to come out with consensus regarding a sanction in Israel, if a Palestinian Authority is strong enough to make its own, to change the way it works, and so on and so forth, and say, I, Netanyahu, and my ally Trump are strong enough to just do it at once, declare sovereignty over the entire territory, the same 30% more or less that Trump plan draws, that is unrational in our vision, but US has let us, let's use this permission and just take whatever we can. And once it's done, it's very hard to undo. According to the Israeli law, to annex, you need just a majority in the government, and to give away land, you need a much bigger majority in the parliament. So let's just do it and then face the results. The other way that we are preparing ourselves that this will be done is the salami method. Let's have a small annexation, more conservative way. let's just try, take a very consensual territory, let's say Gush Etzion. It has a very long living legacy of Jewish heritage, and people in Israel and in the world see it as Jewish. There are not many Palestinians who live there, and some of it will remain Israeli under any two-state agreement. So let's just declare sovereignty there and see what happens. Nothing will happen because it's so small and it doesn't worth the risk of cutting relations with Israel, or the risk of Palestinians risking what they do have now in their lives, basically. And after we tested the water, we'll annex a bit more and a bit more. This is a bit similar to the settlement enterprise. We built on a hill, then we built on the next hill, then we built on the next hill. So for that reason, we believe this is a way that might be used again by Netanyahu's government. But again, they keep talking about this window of opportunity, and they might just use it to annex all at once. So these are the two scenarios that we see. And by the way, I said Gush Etzion, it might also be just Ma'ale Adumim, just part of Jordan Valley, just some part that is more consensual, less risky in terms of a harsh sites of Palestinians being taken away, and good old settlements that are considered Israeli in many aspects being adopted into the Israeli mainstream consensus, and everybody will be happy in Israel and maybe also around the world. And that this is the way to laundry this entire process. So these are the two possible directions we think of.
Thank you, Shaked. Yuda, do you want to weigh in really quickly, or do you want to?
Just on the last point that Shaked said about the possibility of kind of like doing a small annexation and then people will kind of like breathe, you know, the worst didn't happen, it's okay. I do think it is a risk. And I think it's important to highlight that once you annex even 1 square meter, you basically move to a different category, to a different regime and a different reality. And you know, when Russia annexed Crimea, no one asked, what is the percentage of Crimea out of Ukraine? Is Crimea the Gush Etzion of the West Bank? Is that the consensus Russian settlement versus other territories? Yeah, it was very clear that vis-a-vis international law, the global rule-based order, a world that condones annexation is a world that incentivizes wars of aggression. It was very clear to the decision makers, that if you don't respond right now with everything, Crimea is just the beginning. And that's going to be the same with Israel. Yeah, we have an expression in Hebrew, we call it, with the food comes the appetite. Yeah, meaning if you will annex only one settlement and nothing is going to happen, you cross the line, and then every year, every election, the annexation forces will not rest until they get everything. And just like today, we don't have an announcement of 2,000 houses in a settlement every day, but we have it once a year, definitely before every election. The same will happen with annexation. That's why it's important not to fall into the trap that Shaked just pointed out. Yeah, very importantly, I think.
Great, thank you very much. So this is all really, really good stuff. What I want to do in this round, at least very briefly, maybe not in this great detail, I want to talk about the political context for all of us sitting on this side of the ocean and maybe in Europe. Yuda, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to just dump a bunch and just address what you think is most important. Are there domestic Israeli political forces still opposing annexation? The security, national security, intelligence folks, the people who worry about peace with Jordan. And what about the media analysis, which somehow says that Gantz and Ashkenazi are still going to somehow hold out hope for being moderating forces? And lastly, Supreme Court. Is there a legal option for challenging this, and any possibility of that actually being a break on the rushed annexation?
I think the most important in my eyes is to kind of like shed light on the issue of kind of like the security folks and Gantz and Ashkenazi. If I go back to my division of political camps in Israel earlier, I would put most of the so-called security establishment in what I call the control camp. Yeah, the ones who believe that we need to stay the only sovereign power river to the sea, but we can play with how much autonomy we can allow Palestinians to run their own life. Yeah, in order not to be in a place that we formally annexed, and then we have no alibi anymore when people come to us and say you are apartheid. Yeah, that's kind of like, yeah, to kind of like put it in few sentences on a bumper sticker style language. So I think for them, yeah, the fight against annexation, what they're very, very scared of is to give up one thing that Israel achieved and in their eyes shouldn't give up. And that is superior demographics within the Green Line. Okay, you had the Palestinian perspective of annexation. It happened on May 15th, on Nakba Day. Okay, the results of the war in 1948 ultimately established Jewish the Green Line. Annexation, meaning erasing the Green Line, even if for sure it's going to take place, as Shaked explained, with gerrymandering, yeah, maximum territory, minimum Palestinians, will still turn the map river to the sea to one area. Once you erase the Green Line, it's all one regime. You can't say anymore there is civilian parliamentary Israel within the Green Line and Israeli military outside the Green Line. It's one. With Bantustans, yeah, no news. So gerrymandering is definitely the term, but it's not that Palestinians have a right to vote. Gerrymandering is in those districts, they don't have the right to vote, right? So this is not just annexation. We are taking the land without the territory. And by the way, I don't know if how many people know it, but in 1970, the South African government, the South African parliament passed the so-called the Bantu Homeland Citizenship Act, which intended to do exactly that, which is all blacks in South Africa lost their citizenship and they became citizens of the tribal homelands, yeah, their own real state, the Bantustan. And then South Africa came in and said, what do you want? There is no blacks in South Africa. Oh, these are people who come from Zululand, who come to work here. The same will happen with Palestinians. You know, oh, Palestinians, we heard about them. They live in Ramallah land and they just come to work here. Yeah, that's exactly the setting. So what the security establishment is afraid very much is turning it into a formalizing a one state, and that's where we lose the demographic superiority. That's what they're scared the hell out, okay? Erasing the Green Line will tell everyone, river to the sea is one territory, and suddenly it's not 80% versus 20% today in the Green Line, but 50-50 river to the sea. And then what do you do? And that scares the hell out of them. So I really think that, sadly enough, it's not out of a principal position fighting for equality, but it's about how do we preserve Israeli control river to the sea without formalizing sovereignty that will bring us to lose our greatest achievement of pre-67. That's at least the way I understand it.
Thank you. So Shaked, moving to sort of the activist side, the left, can you talk to us a little bit about where the left is politically with this in opposition with what's left of Meretz, with the what appears to be the rise of the joint list in a way that maybe is encouraging but offers a different way forward? And can you also talk to us about what peace now and pro-peace activism and solidarity look like in an era where annexation is on the agenda and potentially in an era where annexation has happened? How do you do your work when most of your work has been about fighting something that at that point will have already happened?
Well, I'll divide my answer to before and after annexation. Before annexation, what we see now in the political arena is the Joint List talking very outspokenly against annexation, of course, and against occupation, against apartheid, and they understand I think the way that Yehuda just presented it, the entire space as a non-equal space, and annexation only adds to the even racism and risk that the Israeli Palestinians, Israeli Arabs are facing all along the years, and more formally since the nation-state law passed. So they see and show this very straight link between annexation and the character of Israel, and the attempt to erase the part of Israeli Palestinians in it. And it was manifested, by the way, in a demonstration that we held in February, right after Trump plan was released, with the support of FMEP, so thank you for that. There was a rally of Jewish and Arab activists opposing Trump plan and saying out loud that annexation cannot happen, and is again, you cannot bring an annexationist plan and call it a peace plan, because the two are contrary. I'll keep with this political overview. So Meretz, of course, is against annexation and is for the two-state solution, and most of its representatives speak against it very freely. And the interesting part of that I think that to talk about is the center left that has joined the government. They keep saying, maybe because of the rationalization that Yehuda spoke about, but they are against annexation. They say they are against it because I'm talking about most of Blue and White and all of Labour Party. They say that unilateral annexation contradicts peace prospects, and they are for the two-state solution, and it is very, it's not very easy to believe to them, because they don't actually lead any attempts to reinitiate the negotiations, but they do their agenda draws a two-state solution, and of course that annexation is against it, but they claim that they will be more effective in stopping it from inside the government. That's their message to the public till now. Last night, there was the new government was passed in parliament, and in Netanyahu's speech, he spoke very openly about annexation. By the way, here they call it Israeli sovereignty, not annexation. Annexation is a word used by its opposers. And then Benny Gantz didn't say a word about it. Our mission, if you ask what our mission is to push Gantz and his people to admit that they oppose annexation and to act against it like they promised they will do. And they will need to know that their voters will not support them anymore once a government that they are part of annexes territories against the people's will. And I'm saying against the people's will because annexation is like Yehuda said, there is a camp that has always supported annexation, and our camp, who supports the two-state solution, I'll say it another way. Annexation is an agenda belonging to a minority in Israel's society, even in Israel's Jewish society. The rest were just put to sleep after many years of right-wing government and campaigns by the right wing in Israel saying that we cannot negotiate with the Palestinians because it threats Israel's security. And now when annexation really comes, most of our people are still asleep. They don't see it as part of their daily lives concerns. As I told you, they ask, what does it have to do with my life? Peace is not around the corner anyway. There is no prospect for peace. So why should I care about annexation? But the optimistic side of it is that this asleep peace camp is starting to awaken because of this discourse that is starting to rise. We in Peace Now have been experiencing hard times trying to bring the political issue, the conflict, to the front and center of the political discourse in Israel. Every time that when peace negotiations were part of Israel's daily news cycle, then every announcement by Peace Now about, as Yuda said, the yearly 2,000 housing units was met with wide criticism, with headlines in the newspapers, and with reaction. For many years now, not so many, but let's say along the decade of Netanyahu's reign, this criticism was shut down because housing units are built and nothing happens. So why should we announce it in the newspapers?
Yeah.
And
Sheket, I'm sorry to cut you off. We're running a little bit short on time, and I want to get at least one round of questions in before we close.
So I'll come to my bottom line about that. I just want to tell you that people are knocking my door, the ones that are not very afraid from the corona, saying, okay, here we are beginning to understand that there is a major change that is going to happen and the peace camp must rise. Please tell us what to do. So this is in a way a wake-up call for the peace camp, and and we are preparing a fight. This is not going to pass silently, and there are people willing to come with us to this fight.
Thanks. I want to turn now, if we can, briefly to the international response. We've seen a lot of statements from Europeans, from the EU as a body, but also from individual European states, from the collective of the Arab League, but also we saw a very strong warning from King Abdullah in Jordan, specifically, essentially putting the peace treaty with Jordan on the line. What is likely, first of all, how are Israelis receiving, do these international warnings have an effect on Israeli public opinion? Is it giving anyone in Israel pause? And second, what would it take? Would you expect to see any follow-up to these warnings? My own sense is that Israelis can deal with lots of very, very harsh criticism. What they can't accept, I think, is some sort of some sort of consequence. Do you see that coming from the international community writ large, or from individual actors like the EU or certain Arab states? I put the same question to the two of you. Let's start with Yehuda.
Look, in principle, by the way, I think that it is important, crucial, that we Israelis who are against annexation do what we can in order to try to prevent it. But at the end of the day, I think this is bigger than us. This is bigger than us because, as Shaked said, This is not something that is supported by white Israeli Jews. This is pushed by a minority with a lot of power with the Trump administration, okay? And just like the other Israelis didn't really care about occupation, majority of Israelis will not care about annexation and apartheid, yeah? There was no majority of whites in South Africa against apartheid. There was no majority of whites in the South in Alabama in 1950 against segregation. Today, when you ask people, apparently everybody was against it. But at the time, yeah, people with privileges don't tend to stand up and you know, give up their privileges without paying a price. So I actually think the ball is completely in the court of the international community, Europeans, Arabs, etc., and definitely Palestinians in terms of their response and what that will mean. I look at this less about changing Israeli public opinion, but changing cost-benefit calculation of our leaders here, okay? So you are not, no matter what you're gonna do, people who vote for Naftali Bennett, or majority of people who vote for Netanyahu, you're not gonna change their ideas. You might influence people who voted to Gantz, but not to Netanyahu, okay? What you need with your measures, and when I say you, I mean the international community, is make sure that that this is not just empty words, yeah? That can deter the entire Israeli system from taking this step. And I think that's the difference. It's about changing the cost-benefit calculation of the leadership.
Then I shall agree and disagree. I agree that Israeli annexation opposition must raise its voice, and that's what we are going to do in the next few months. This is our money time, our like maybe the biggest fight in the history of the peace camp. And I think that the international community might save us from ourselves, but we must play our role in showing that there is a hardcore of Israelis who are who oppose this. And on the other hand, you said, Yuda, that Likud voters cannot be convinced by the international community. I partly disagree. I think that among Netanyahu voters, there are people that like to see a almighty leader in Israel, and Netanyahu keeps telling them how he controls and improves international relations of Israel with the world, and brings economy and brings all sorts of benefits from his personal ties that he brags about so much. And once Netanyahu is I don't know, like, is criticized and is punished and is not rewarded so widely by the international community, maybe he can lose support in Israel too. I think that some of these voters don't vote for annexation. Otherwise, you know, Netanyahu doesn't have a platform. The Likud doesn't publish a platform. They don't say, vote Likud because we love Greater Israel. Bennett does that. Netanyahu doesn't do it. It says, vote Netanyahu because he's a strong man. So once it's not so strong, or once Israel has to pay prices, I believe that also even Netanyahu supporters might oppose annexation. And this is also consistent in some surveys. Some of Netanyahu supporters also believe that he will bring peace. So once this vision is broken, maybe the anti-annexation camp in Israel is maybe wider than it seems now.
Let's not forget that the annexation today is part of peace. Yeah, the Trump plan. Yeah, that's exactly what the Americans are selling us. And this is why I think it's important for us to understand that sometimes talking about interests doesn't always work, because Netanyahu manages to improve economy, relations, the Gulf, etc., while entrenching occupation, expanding settlements, and even flirting with annexation. I think it's time for a value-based position. Yeah, what kind of Israel we want to live in? A democratic country or apartheid? Or a reality, do we aspire to live in a place where everyone who lives under our rule is equal in front of the law? Because that's not the case today. Another thing, if I may just add to that, is I think something for us progressives in Israel and the US, we need to learn. The driving force behind the annexation today is less the Israeli annexationist, it's more the American annexationist. It is that cooperation. And you know why we are so weak? Because when our allies, or supposed to be allies, take power in the US or in Europe, they don't have the spine to run a policy according to their values. And once the allies of the annexationists here get the White House, they send David Friedman here, and you see what he does. Yeah, that's the difference. A lot of the strength of the annexationists in Israel comes from the fact that their allies across the ocean are actually willing to put their money in politics, yeah, and their mouth and their power at the same basket. So I think for you, progressives in the US, for the Democratic Party, if there is one thing ahead of the next elections is to really understand that. And hopefully we will see a different kind of politics coming out of DC.
All right, and that is a great point to end on. I'm sorry to cut you both short. We're trying to keep these to an hour and respectful of our audience. I wish we could go on for quite a bit longer. This is really, really important and interesting. But we're going to close it off here. So on behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and the Middle East Institute, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank everyone who tuned in, everyone who submitted questions. There was a question. The questions are, there are, I think, 30 questions. You can't see them. This is part of the security because of Zoom bombing. We make a lot less of the stuff, give a lot less opportunities for trolls to inject their poison into our events. So you don't see the questions. But for people who did submit questions that weren't touched on in the answers, you should know that we're going to give them in writing to the panelists so that the panelists will have this as a guide to what people are thinking and what they want to know more about. So thanks for everyone. For folks who want to follow our panelists on Twitter or on Facebook, I think that was all put into the chat box. And you can check back at the Middle East Institute website or the Foundation for Middle East Peace website for more information and for video of this conference, which I want to remind people is part of a 3-part conference. So if you missed the first 2, you should check them out as well. They were terrific. I also want to thank MEI for being a great partner on this webinar series. I look forward to more. There's certainly a lot more to cover. And hopefully we can have both of these great panelists back again for a future discussion. So thank you very much. And that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lara, Khaled, Shaked.
Thank you, Yehuda and Shaked and Lara. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.